March 17th, 1943, east coast of Greenland. The wind screamed across the frozen cliffs like a wounded animal. Temperatures had plummeted to -40, and the snow-covered fjords glittered under a pale Arctic moon. Nothing moved. Nothing alive, at least. Except one thing. High above the glacial ridgelines, the dark silhouette of a Junkers Ju-88, a twin-engine Nazi reconnaissance plane, cut through the polar night. Low, silent, hunting. The aircraft wasn't supposed to be there, at least not officially. But since 1942, German weather teams had been slipping into Greenland's vast, uninhabited coastlines, building hidden meteorological stations to feed weather intel back to U-boats and Luftwaffe bomber wings across the Atlantic. For the Nazis, weather was war. Whoever controlled the skies controlled the tides of battle, and the Americans knew it. From a remote Arctic outpost near Scoresby Sund, a small U.S. Air Force detachment monitored the ice, waiting. Radar was unreliable here, blocked by jagged mountains, blinded by magnetic storms. There were no anti-aircraft guns, no radar nets, and no patrol planes fast enough to intercept. So they turned to the only eyes that never failed in Greenland. A man named Aput Nanoq. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even on payroll. Just a quiet Inuit hunter who wore sealskin boots, spoke broken Danish, and never missed a kill. He lived off whale meat and glacial meltwater, navigated blizzards by the smell of the wind. And while the Americans wrestled with topographical maps and faulty compasses, Aput moved through the ice fields like he'd been born from them. But tonight was different, because tonight, the hunter wasn't chasing seal or caribou. Tonight, he was hunting a Nazi warplane with nothing but an ancient harpoon passed down through 4 generations. The younger airman laughed. A harpoon? Against a Ju-88? One GI yoked. What's he gonna do? Asked the Luftwaffe to fly lower so he can poke it. But Lieutenant Halvorsen didn't laugh. He glanced up at the sky. Tomorrow, he muttered, the bird will fall. They found him outside the Quonset hut at sunrise, kneeling in the snow, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, working quietly with a worn carving knife and a strip of darkened wood. Aput Nanoq, the Inuit hunter who had tracked walrus across frozen oceans and once killed a polar bear with a single throw, was building something. The young sergeant leaned over Halvorsen's shoulder. What the hell's he making? Looks like a snow shovel got in a fight with a javelin. Lieutenant Halvorsen didn't answer. He just watched. What lay across Aput's lap wasn't any ordinary weapon. It was a Kiajak harpoon, the kind his people had used for centuries, but this one had been altered, reinforced with iron bands near the tip. The wood had been soaked in seal fat, giving it a dull, oily gleam. And running along its shaft were hand-carved grooves etched with geometric patterns that none of the Americans recognized. Not decorative, calculated. Aput didn't speak much English. But when Halvorsen crouched down and asked, "What's that for?" Aput answered in a low, steady voice. "You mean the propellers? Spin fast. Too fast for gun. Not too fast for this." It sounded insane. But in this place where maps lied, radios went silent, and frost killed in minutes. Aput's instincts had saved them more than once. And Halvorsen had learned not to ask how he knew the things he did. Still, others weren't so trusting. Back inside the barracks, the briefing room devolved into half-muttered jokes and nervous tension. "So what's the plan, LT? We let our Eskimo ninja chuck a pointy stick at a bomber and hope for the best. What's next? Training the sled dogs to jam radio signals." But outside, Aput kept working, testing weight distribution, balancing the shaft across his palm, adding a small piece of flattened lead to the tip to make it dive. He wrapped the handle in polar bear sinew for grip, and used a curved bone wedge to create a spiral in the flight path. He explained only once. "You don't hit the plane, you unbalance it." Aput didn't believe in brute force. His world was about leverage, timing, pressure. A single crack in the ice could split a glacier. A tiny shift in wind could flip a kayak. So too could a harpoon if it struck the right place. That night, he stood outside, scanning the moonlit horizon. The harpoon was done. No fanfare, no ceremony. He simply leaned it against the snow wall, sat by the fire, and sharpened the blade in silence, while the Americans debated radar reports and argued about cloud cover. Only Halverson noticed that Aput never looked at the maps. He looked at the sky. Tomorrow, he repeated softly. The bird will fly low, the wind will bend, and I will throw. March 18th, 1943, 0620 hours. The sun hadn't cleared the ice cliffs yet, but the sky was already bright, blindingly bright, the kind of light that bounced off the glacier and pierced through your eyelids, even with them closed. Inside the observation shack, Sergeant Connors was hunched over a steaming cup of powdered coffee when the radio cracked once, then died. He tapped it. Nothing. Tapped again. Static. Then, silence. Great, he muttered. Another day without comms. Outside, the wind had calmed to a low whistle, carrying only the distant sound of creaking ice. It was too quiet. No birds. No howling. No shifting snow. Just the feeling that eerie, skin-tightening instinct soldiers get when something is off. And Aput Nanoq felt it first. He was already on the ridge, eyes to the east, standing motionless in the snow. The harpoon lay across his shoulder, perfectly balanced. His breath came slow and steady, vapor curling into the sky. He didn't need radar. He didn't need radio. He had ice vision, a term the Americans invented to explain what he did. He could read the shimmering of light on snowbanks, the flicker of wind through frozen grass, the way a shadow moved half a second too soon. And right now, he saw it. A faint glint metal catching sun on the far side of the fjord. There, he whispered. 0642 hours, 3,000 feet above ground. The Junkers Ju-88 approached low and fast, its twin propellers slicing through cold air like a bone saw. The Germans had flown this route before probing for signs of Allied activity along the southeastern coast. Aput had watched them for days. Their flight path always dipped through the same frozen valley, hugging the terrain to stay under American radar. This time, the Americans were ready, but not in the way the Luftwaffe expected. Halverson and a three-man recon team crouched behind an outcrop of ice, 200 yards from Aput's firing position. None of them spoke. They'd already argued the night before, already voiced their disbelief. Now they could only wait. Aput knelt in the snow, his back straight, shoulders squared. He held the harpoon like a javelin, angling it toward the narrow corridor between two sheer cliffs, the kill zone. His fingers gripped the sinew, wrapping tight. The Ju-88 screamed closer, banking slightly. Lower, lower. 0646 hours. Impact moment. Time slowed. As the plane roared into view, Aput rose with fluid grace, twisted at the waist, and launched the harpoon with both hands not upward, but forward, leading the plane like a hunter leads a running elk. The weapon spun, fast and tight, catching the sunlight like a meteor. It didn't hit the fuselage. It didn't need to. It struck the outer hub of the starboard propeller, slamming into the fast-rotating blades with a violent clack, and then shrapnel, shuddering, imbalance. The right engine coughed once, then screamed. The plane lurched sideways, listing hard to starboard as the prop lost its rhythm. The Germans inside had no idea what hit them. To them, it felt like mechanical failure. They had no concept for a hand-thrown object striking a precision-engineered machine at 200 miles per hour. They never made the next ridge. The Ju-88 clipped the canyon wall and exploded in a rolling bloom of black fire and spinning metal. The noise echoed for 30 seconds, then vanished into the mountains. Aftermath. The American recon team stared in stunned silence. No one cheered. No one spoke. Finally, Halverson broke the silence. Did that just happen? Aput walked down the slope, retrieved what remained of the harpoon shaft from the snow, and held it up. Cracked, but not broken. Blackened snow crunched beneath their boots as they moved carefully through the twisted wreckage of what had once been a Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft. Pieces of aluminum skin still hissed with heat. One propeller blade was embedded in a wall of blue ice, like a broken wing from some mechanical bird of prey. Halverson stepped over a piece of the shattered fuselage, scanning the area with his sidearm drawn, not because he expected survivors, but because his brain hadn't caught up to what his eyes were seeing. Jesus, one corporal muttered. He actually did it. 3 crew members, all deceased. One still strapped into a buckled cockpit seat. The other 2 thrown free, half buried in the snow. No bullet wounds, no flak damage, no signs of AA fire. But the starboard engine housing the one Aput had aimed for was shredded from the inside. The propeller mount was bent and cracked, and lodged deep in the gearbox, surrounded by twisted fan blades, was a single piece of curved wood wrapped in metal bands. A harpoon fragment, exactly where it shouldn't be. 1,057 hours. Field notes. Lieutenant Halverson, USAF, Reconnaissance Unit, Greenland Station 4. Unexplained mechanical failure of German aircraft, likely mid-flight destabilization. Propeller hub penetrated by non-ballistic foreign object. Object appears handcrafted. Wood shaft, iron bands, spiral etching, possibly indigenous in origin. Cause of crash not attributable to Allied ordnance. He stopped writing, then underlined those last 4 words. He knew what the higher-ups would say. Impossible. He could already hear the voices at HQ. A hand-thrown spear, at altitude, moving target, dismissed. They'd chalk it up to stress, coincidence, maybe sabotage on the German side. But the wreckage didn't lie, and neither did Aput. Later that day, outpost barracks. The mood had changed. The same soldiers who'd rolled their eyes the day before now stared at Aput like he was made of iron and shadows. No one laughed. No more jokes about Eskimo voodoo or caveman tricks. Just quiet nods and the occasional sideways glance of disbelief. But Aput didn't bask in the moment. He simply sat near the stove, sewing the torn edge of his mittens with sinew thread, like nothing had happened. "You ever done that before?" he asked. Aput looked up, expression unreadable, then shrugged. "First plane, what the hell did you aim for?" "Vibration," Aput said. "The song it sings when it turns. You can feel where it's weakest." Halverson stared at him, unsure whether he was hearing ancient wisdom or madness or both. "The song it sings?" Aput didn't answer. He just kept sewing. March 20th, 1943. U.S. Weather Command Forward Report, classified. German aircraft downed over eastern Greenland. Preliminary evidence inconclusive. Enemy remains recovered. Weather station location compromised. Civilian tracker may have contributed. Recommend minimal documentation. Minimal documentation was code. It meant, bury it. And they did. The official report would say, engine failure. Aircraft lost control. No enemy action suspected. But for those who were there, for the men who watched the impossible happen with their own eyes, that harpoon stuck in a Nazi engine wasn't folklore. It was fact. And deep beneath the glacier where the wreckage lay frozen into the earth, the metal bands and splintered wood still sat in silence, evidence buried not just in ice, but in history. March 21st, 1943. Greenland outpost, noon. Lieutenant Eric Halverson found Aput Nanoq exactly where he expected him, sitting alone on a small rise above the outpost, surrounded by blowing snow, staring out across a frozen horizon that stretched forever. Aput wasn't carving, wasn't cleaning his gear, wasn't mending sealskin boots or boiling snow for water. He was simply watching the ice, the same way a general might study a map. Halverson approached quietly and sat down beside him. For a long moment, neither man said a word. Only the wind filled the silence, soft, steady, almost respectful. Finally, Halverson spoke. "Headquarters isn't going to believe any of it." Aput didn't look away from the distance. "Doesn't matter if they believe," he said. "The ice believes." Halverson exhaled. He never knew whether that kind of answer was poetry or just literal Inuit thinking. Maybe both. They're writing the crash up as mechanical failure. Aput nodded once, unsurprised. The Americans valued data, numbers, machines. They didn't value stories, especially not stories told by a man who didn't speak their language fluently. "You saved our lives," Halverson said. "Mine, the whole outpost. You know that, right?" Aput finally turned his head. "You saved yourselves. I only pushed the wind. A lesson from the ice." Halverson frowned. "Pushed the wind?" Aput lifted a gloved hand and pointed toward the fjord. Everything that moves, moves because something else pushed first. The goose flies because the wind carries it. The snow falls because the sun weakens it. The plane turns because the propeller sings. He paused. And the harpoon? It moves because I have listened to the wind longer than that pilot has flown. The lieutenant didn't know what to say. It was the closest thing to an explanation Aput had ever given. Two men, two worlds. For a moment, Halverson saw Aput differently, not as an eccentric tracker or a local guide, but as a man whose entire life was built on precision, the same precision pilots and engineers used, just expressed through bone, sinew, and instinct, instead of charts and compasses. How did you know the plane would fly that route? Halverson asked. Aput tapped 2 fingers against the side of his nose. Smell. Halverson blinked. You smelled the plane? Aput shook his head. No, the cold smelled different. Engines change the air long before the ears hear them. Halverson tried to process that. How do you smell motion? How do you smell metal and heat through a blizzard? But Aput wasn't done. He pointed again, this time toward a patch of blue ice shimmering like glass. The shadow told me the rest. Halverson followed his gaze, seeing nothing but ice and glare. What shadow? The one you didn't see, Aput answered simply. A friendship formed in silence. The lieutenant finally laughed softly, helplessly. You know they're going to ask me for a full written report. Aput stood, brushing snow from his sealskin trousers. Then write this, he said. A hunter knows the world better than the man who only measures it. Halverson stared at him, struck by the quiet truth of it. The 2 men began the walk back toward the outpost. The wind blew hard against them, but Aput didn't bow his head like the Americans did. He leaned into it, almost welcomed it, as if the wind were not an enemy, but an old friend whispering secrets across the ice. A new threat in the fog. As they approached the station, Sergeant Connors rushed out, waving frantically. Lieutenant, radar just picked up something. Weak signal. Maybe interference. Maybe another plane. Halverson felt his pulses spike. Aput stopped walking. His eyes narrowed toward the coastline, listening, reading the air. Then he spoke in a voice that turned Connors pale. Not plane. A long pause. Ship. March 22nd, 1943, Greenland coast, 3:12 hours. The sea was too calm. That was the first warning sign. The fjord had been whipped by wind for days, rising chop, snow squalls, screaming gusts. But now, the waves had gone flat. The fog rolled in, like a living wall, thick and heavy, choking off the moonlight. Visibility dropped to 30 yards, then 20. It's not static, he muttered. It's rhythmic. Like sonar ping, but warped. He glanced up. Maybe Allied shipping? Lieutenant Halverson shook his head. No convoys this far north, not without air cover. Then Aput Nanoq walked in and said 2 words that froze the room. Metal shark. Everyone turned. Come again. Connors blinked. Underwater hunter. Long. Steel. Aput extended his arms, mimicking a torpedo. They breathe sometimes, only when fog hides them. Halverson's face darkened. U-boat. A ghost from the deep. The Germans had long used U-boats to drop off weather teams along Greenland's coast. A few times, they'd even landed small squads of saboteurs tasked with cutting cables or installing remote beacons. That Ju-88 Aput brought down wasn't scouting alone. It had been coordinating with something beneath the waves. And now, whatever that was, it had returned. At 3:30, Aput climbed a nearby ridge alone. No snowshoes, no rifle. Just a hand-carved bone-listening horn strapped across his back, a tool older than any sonar. He planted one knee in the snow, tilted the cone toward the sea, and pressed his ear to the hollowed end. 10 seconds. 20. 30. Then he stood and pointed south, toward a thin strip of water just beginning to melt for spring. There, he said, near rock shaped like whale tail, Operation Fogland. Halverson moved quickly. By dawn, the Americans had assembled a small forward observation team, 3 men with binoculars, a 30 calories machine gun, and 1 box of dynamite that hadn't frozen solid. The plan wasn't to attack. It was to watch. Confirm. then call for Allied naval support. But Aput had other ideas. If they come ashore, he said quietly, they won't leave. The warning from the ice. At 8:42, a gray fin surfaced. Not from a fish, but from a conning tower, black iron cutting through the slush like the back of some ancient sea beast. A U-boat, probably a type IXC, long range, built for special ops drops. 2 men emerged, scanning the shore with binoculars. Then, a dinghy was lowered. They're landing, Connors whispered, adrenaline rising. Shit, they're landing. Only 2 men? Halverson asked. No, recon first. The rest will follow if the coast's clear. Aput stood nearby, silent, watching. He turned to Halverson and held up a small satchel, a pouch of tightly packed seal fat and bone fragments, tied with sinew. For them, he said. That's not a weapon, the lieutenant said. That's bait. It's smoke, Aput replied. But the kind that hunts back. Smoke and ice. At 9:03, just as the Germans made landfall, Aput crept downwind. He pulled a match from inside his sealskin glove and lit the pouch, placing it behind a jagged rock. Within seconds, it began to smoke slowly at first, then in thick, oily waves that hugged the ice like liquid shadow. The mixture of seal fat, dry bone, and crushed moss gave off a smell like burnt copper and rotting salt. And more importantly, it clung to clothing, to gaar, to skin. They'll carry the scent back, Aput said. Their pack will think they were marked by death. Backlash in the bay. It worked. The 2 Germans landed, approached the rocks cautiously, then turned back after 10 minutes of scouting. They said nothing into their radios, but their body language told the story. Uncertainty, nervous glances, tension in their strides. 15 minutes later, the U-boat submerged, panicked, not planned. The mission was aborted. Whatever they thought was waiting on shore. They wanted no part of it. What was never filed. Halverson's field report read, unconfirmed U-boat presence. No engagement. Landing aborted after observation of shoreline. Atmospheric conditions obscured tactical opportunity. No mention of Aput. No mention of seal smoke traps. No mention of a bone listening horn that detected sonar pings before radar did. But off record, every man at that station knew. The U-boat didn't leave because of weather. It left because of something it didn't understand. Something older than war. Something born of ice, silence, and instinct. March 25th, 1943, U.S. Weather Outpost, East Greenland. A snowstorm had locked them in for 2 days. Winds hit 70 knots. Visibility dropped to 0. The kind of storm that tore off roof panels and made compass needles spin. The kind of storm that Aput Nanoq walked through without flinching. Inside the outpost, the men passed time with cards, coffee, and arguments. Outside, Aput was carving. Not a harpoon this time. Something smaller, stranger. A thin wooden rod, etched with ridges like a pine cone. Each groove spaced exactly, not decorative but functional. Next to it lay a small pouch of ash-colored powder, sealed in fish skin. Halverson approached cautiously. What is it this time? He asked. Aput didn't look up. A song stopper. What? For the plane that sings. You stop the song, the wings forget how to fly. The lieutenant's dilemma. Later that evening, Halverson pulled out his logbook and tried to document what he had seen over the last week. 1 Nazi aircraft, destroyed in flight. 1 U-boat, aborted landing without engagement. 0 shots fired by American personnel. And yet, here they were. Alive. Intact. Victorious. Because of a man with no rank, no badge, no blueprint, just instinct. But what was he supposed to write? That a sealskin pouch had stopped a German landing? That a hand-thrown spear had broken a precision German propeller? That his civilian tracker had somehow turned the elements themselves into weapons? No officer at HQ would buy it. Worse, they might court-martial him for filing a false report, or pull Aput into custody for further examination. So Halverson did what military officers often do when truth collides with protocol. He wrote the truth but didn't send it. The hidden report. On page 23 of his private field log, Beneath a taped Polaroid of the wrecked Ju-88, Halverson scrawled the following: the 25th of March, 1943. The hunter's method is not myth. It is physics in a language we don't speak. His weapons are born of environment, not laboratories. His calculations are sound. His aim is terrifying. His silence is deliberate. If war is fought with tools, then this man is not primitive. He is years ahead of us, just wearing older clothes. He tore the page out and slid it into a sealed envelope. Then he hid it, not in the official dispatch pouch, but inside a weatherproof box, tucked beneath the floorboard in the comms room. A note on the box read simply, "To be opened when someone finally believes the impossible." One last lesson. That night, over boiled Arctic char and reindeer broth, Halverson sat across from Aput at the long mess bench. No one else was awake. Just the two of them. Steam rose from their bowls like ghosts. "You could have killed them," Halverson said quietly. Aput sipped his soup. Aput nodded slowly. "Better to make them doubt than bury them. Doubt walks back to its ship and warns the others. Death makes no sound. But fear talks. Recognition and silence. And when headquarters radioed back with a routine, acknowledged, continue operations, he simply nodded. Out here, far from medals and manuals, some weapons were meant to stay invisible. April 2nd, 1943, 5:19 hours, overcast skies. It started as a hum. Low, distant, mechanical. The kind of sound that melts into the wind if you're not trained to hear it. The second Ju-88. This one flew lower, slower, deliberate. The Ju-88 wasn't just gathering weather intel. It was looking for something, perhaps a crash site, a missing recon crew, or proof of an outpost they never expected to lose a plane to. Aput watched the clouds shift. He turned to Halverson, who was already loading his M1 carbine, not because it would help, but because it was all he had. "Any ideas, Snow Ghost?" Aput unrolled a long strip of sealskin from his pouch. Inside was the song stopper, the spiral-carved rod and ash powder blend he'd prepared days earlier. They moved fast, Aput in the lead, Halverson and two airmen behind. The chosen location was a narrow ice canyon between two rock walls, a natural air funnel, just wide enough for a pilot to mistake for safe passage if flying low. Aput set the trap at the canyon mouth. He planted the spiral rod upright in the snow, buried the ash pouch 6 inches deep at its base, and laid small animal bones in concentric circles around it. "Looks like Vodo," one airman muttered. "Looks like physics," Halverson corrected. Aput took a small ember from a wrapped coal pot and set it inside the pouch. "The wind will carry it," he said. "Carry what?" Halverson asked. "Vibration. The same note the wings sing." The flight pass is over. 6:44 hours. The Ju-88 banked into the canyon, exactly as Aput predicted. It was textbook Luftwaffe tactics: stay low, use terrain, avoid radar, then disappear. The pilot would have seen nothing, just flat snow and clean air. But then, it happened. The wind shifted. A faint tone filled the canyon. Not a whistle, not a howl. More like resonance. The ash below Aput's spiral rod ignited not into fire, but vibration. The rod began to hum, matching the pitch of the approaching aircraft, and the plane shuddered. The shiver of the machine. From below it looked like nothing had happened. But inside the cockpit of the Ju-88, the instruments flickered. The altimeter dropped 20 feet. The oil gauge surged. One propeller shaft wobbled just slightly, but enough. The spiral resonance, primitive, analog, inexplicable, interfered with the plane's vibration harmonics, not unlike how opera singers crack glass. The aircraft dropped another 20 feet. Then, 30. The pilot yanked the stick up. The plane overcorrected, clipped the canyon wall, and ripped the right engine clean off. The Ju-88 spun, slammed into the ice face, and detonated in a bloom of black smoke and magnesium-white flame. Ash and silence. Halverson stared at the wreckage as it burned. "I need to understand how that worked." Aput didn't answer at first. He picked up the spiral rod, now cracked but still intact. "You don't stop the bird. You interrupt its memory." Halverson blinked. "What?" Machines remember how to fly, but if you change their song, they forget. The last report that never made it. Later that night, Halverson filed no report. Nothing about ash, nothing about resonance, nothing about memory. Just enemy aircraft lost due to terrain collision. No American engagement, 0 casualties. Aput went back to his tent, back to his carving. And in the crater of the destroyed canyon, the only things left behind were one spiral rod, split clean down the middle, a smear of ash, and 2 shattered German dog tags, melted together at the edges like they'd tried to escape but couldn't remember how. May 3, 1943. Keflavik Air Base, Iceland, 930 hours. Lieutenant Eric Halverson sat alone in a cold metal chair, his cap folded in his lap, across from a U.S. Army legal officer reading a clipboard with the emotion of a vending machine. Your original report states the German aircraft went down due to pilot error, the officer repeated. You're certain that's the account you want to maintain? Halverson nodded once, firmly. Yes, sir. Pilot error. Low visibility. Terrain collision. He didn't mention the carved spiral rod. He didn't mention the harpoon. He didn't mention the man who downed 2 aircraft and turned back a U-boat, armed only with instinct, wood, and bone, because he knew the truth didn't fit inside a report. An envelope that wasn't meant to be opened. That night, Halverson returned to his quarters and opened his footlocker. Inside was the sealed weatherproof box, the one with the unofficial report, tucked beneath a cracked Ju-88 propeller bolt and a spiral shard Aput had let him keep. He reread the line he had written weeks ago, to be opened when someone finally believes the impossible. He smiled faintly. No one believed it yet, so the box stayed shut. Meanwhile, north of the circle, in Greenland, the snow had begun to thaw. Aput Nanoq stood alone by the sea ice, watching seals slide across slush like shadows. He was fishing no radio, no orders, no metal, just a sharpened bone spike, a float made from reindeer hide, and a single seal call whistle carved from narwhal tusk. Behind him, the American weather station remained quiet. The radar hummed. The new officer in charge hadn't asked him to return. He didn't need to be asked. He came when he was needed. And now, he wasn't. One final shipment. Back in Iceland, a transport plane bound for Boston prepared for departure. Among its cargo, boxes of intel film, crates of spare propeller parts, and one small wooden crate marked civilian supply, non-essential, native artifacts. Do not open. Inside, nestled in straw padding, lay a scorched iron-banded harpoon tip and a note in Halverson's handwriting. This man stopped a warplane with no gun and turned back a submarine with smoke. He speaks a language no general can understand, but every battlefield should. Recognition, without ceremony. Weeks later, Halverson received a bronze commendation letter for exemplary conduct in extreme northern operations. It came with a ribbon and a handshake from a colonel who'd never heard of Aput. Solid work, Lieutenant. Now let's talk Italy. We've got a new assignment for you. Halverson saluted, packed his duffel, and left the Arctic behind. But before he boarded his new transport, he walked to the edge of the airfield and buried a small carved bone whistle beneath a cairn of black stones. For the one who did more with less, he said softly. Legends that don't get told. Aput never received a medal. No one interviewed him. No newspaper printed his name. No textbook footnote remembered the man who outthought a bomber's propeller. But sometimes, when the sky turned pale blue above the Greenland cliffs, the outpost men swore they could hear a faint hum, a vibration like the echo of wings forgetting how to fly. Washington, D.C., National Military Archives, 1952. It took almost a decade. War had come and gone. New ones had begun. Jet engines had replaced propellers. Radar had become satellite. But some papers, the forgotten ones, still sat unopened, gathering dust in back rooms no one visited. Until one quiet morning in spring, a junior Pentagon analyst named Rebecca Weller was combing through unindexed cargo logs from the Greenland campaign when she came across it. Civilian supply, non-essential, native artifacts. Do not open. The crate had no corresponding personnel file, no citation, no entry in any award record. Just three objects: a cracked spiral rod, a burnt harpoon tip, and a folded note sealed in wax. She opened it, the note that changed the story. It read, "This man stopped a warplane with no gun and turned back a submarine with smoke. He speaks a language no general can understand, but every battlefield should. Lt. Eric Halversen, USAF, March 1943. Weller stared at the signature. She knew that name. Halverson had flown in the Pacific later in the war, decorated, promoted, retired quietly. But there was no mention of Greenland. No medal related to aircraft kills. She filed a recommendation to open a review. It was denied. And just like that, Aput Nanoq vanished again on paper, but not in the ice. Back in Greenland, the old station was gone abandoned in 1946. The runway had cracked. The antennas rusted. Snow had claimed it all. Yet stories remained. Inuit elders still spoke of the one who made the plane fall with no bullet. Children imitated the whistle of the metal bird's death song during games on the cliffs. Hunters passed down a carving technique used to interfere with the wind. And some swore that if you climbed the ridge at dawn, where the first harpoon had flown, you could hear just faintly the hum of broken wings in the distance. Years later, one final return. In 1971, a civilian weather team rediscovered the old outpost's buried storage cellar. They opened it. Inside was the propeller shard, a bone listening horn, and one last item, a photograph, grainy and torn at the corners. It showed a tall American in Arctic fatigues, shaking hands with a small man in sealskin face, expressionless, harpoon strapped to his back. On the back of the photo, in fading pencil, the man who made silence louder than war. And so the ice forgets. But we don't. There was no parade for Aput Nanoq, no statue, no footnote in the military history books. But in that empty sky above Greenland, where two German planes never returned, where one U-boat turned back without firing a shot, where a man stood alone with nothing but instinct and ancestral memory, a story was carved into the wind. And sometimes, that's louder than a medal.